Welcome back to the Curbsiders. I'm Dr. Matthew Frank Watto, here with my great friend and America's primary care physician. And Paul, are you a concussion expert?
I'm more of an expert than I used to be, Matt. How about that?
Okay. Well, Dr. Carlin Senter, who we talked to from UCSF, she is a concussion expert, and she gave us some fantastic pearls. And Paul, I'd like to just start off by saying concussion, to me, it can be not super tricky to diagnose, but sometimes there's there's like these borderline head injuries where I'm just not quite sure. Because I don't know about you, but I always think of the person with like amnesia or who's like really foggy and dazed after they hit their head. Like that's when it's obvious it's a concussion. I don't know. Is this something you struggle with?
Dr. Center mentions a saliva test would be ideal because then you could use it on the sideline. But if there was some sort of concrete objective diagnostic test, that would be great. But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
This was more framed from the position of a primary care doctor. So this is not like the person on the sideline at a sports game. Like this is usually in primary care. You're seeing somebody a couple days or within a day or two of when they've injured themselves. So she said that anybody that has a head injury and then they're coming with symptoms, they could be nonspecific, headache, dizziness, they could be more depressed or anxious, or they could be feeling foggy. You know, those could be compatible with a concussion. When it's obvious, I guess you would say. But when it's not, sometimes there's a lot of borderline head injuries where you're just not sure. We talked about this thing called the SCOT-6, which is this big, long questionnaire.
You can ideally have the patient complete before they actually come to see you, but even going through the questionnaire that's left in the office can be upwards of like 20 minutes, I think she said. So it's a long, involved process. But for a primary care doctor who may not have that kind of time, she did condense symptoms down into sort of 4 major buckets that are worth kind of just delving into with patients. And so those buckets include things like headache, which is probably the most common one. Do they have persistent headache after the head injury? Is their sleep impacted? Which we had a funny side conversation about. For some reason, Matt, we both were exposed to the prevailing wisdom in our youth that if someone had a concussion, you couldn't let them sleep or they would just die instantly, which apparently is not the case. There are emotional components, so sometimes patients may be more anxious or show symptoms of depression following a concussion, though Dr. Center rarely sort of treats those pharmacologically, but at least makes note of them. And then there are the cognitive deficits, so things like the memory loss or feeling kind of foggy or fuzzy or funny after the fact. And if you explore those, you can actually help the patient sort of guide their return to whatever their usual activity was. So if they grade their bothersome symptoms on a scale of 0 to 10, what you basically are supposed to do is advise them to return to their baseline level of activity slowly over time. So the first day or so after the injury, just take it easy, relax, get yourself adequate sleep, and then return to your activities slowly until you get sort of back to your baseline. And if during that recovery time, the symptoms worsen by 2 on a scale of 0 to 10, then probably back off and just kind of give yourself a little bit more time to recover. And that's where I think the buckets are helpful, is kind of just these broad classifications so you can really delve into the symptoms that are most bothersome and have them monitor them for you.
Yeah. And the other thing about the graded return to activity, in the first, if it's a bad concussion or if they're really having a lot of symptoms, in the first 24 to 48 hours, probably they're going to be resting. And then you can start the graded activity. She said she usually does after the first day or two, depending on how they're feeling. So it's not like they had the concussion. You're like, get up off the ground, start your your graded return to activity. But I think that's really helpful. And most patients are not going to need medication for this. If the patients, she said most patients are going to recover over days to weeks. After a couple weeks, like a month or so, most patients' symptoms will be completely gone. But if patients are still having symptoms around the 6 to 8 week mark, that would be when it's a reasonable time to get an MRI of the brain. Usually in the near term, if the patient is having red flags like focal neurodeficits or like major loss of consciousness, that sort of thing, like you're probably going to be getting a dry CT, Paul. That's what the cool kids are saying now, dry CT, CT without contrast to look for bleeding. I think one of the biggest teaching points was like when we used to not feed people with pancreatitis, we thought that was a good idea. We learned that it's actually not a good idea. We do feed people with pancreatitis. Well, for headaches, we used to just think it was just rest. Don't let the person do anything. Now we know this graded return to activity actually works. You don't want to delay recovery by just having the patient expose their brain to nothing for a couple days. That's not good. So this episode, we talk a lot more about concussion, more than we can get into on this short video. So click on the link in the transcript below if you want to hear the full episode. And until next time, I've been Dr. Matthew Frank Watto, and this has been another episode of the Curbsiders, bringing you a little knowledge food for your brain hole.
For your brain hole indeed, Matt. And I remain Dr. Paul Nelson Williams. Thank you and goodbye.